So I'm going to join Dennis and Hubert in this conversation, and we'll see where it takes us. So behind us is the Kandinsky piece. Is this point line playing?
Well, actually, that's composition 8,
Yeah.
which is maybe the best picture.
Right, so that piece that we just saw is inspired by Kandinsky.
Oh, yeah.
So this is
the connection.
Yeah, okay. So thank you very much for your presentations. They're both really interesting and really different, which is a good thing, I think. Let's start with a question, and maybe Hubert, you'll start us off. The thing that I spoke about in my opening remarks about this relationship of the role that mathematics has for you internally as a composer and in listeners' experience of the resulting musical composition. So maybe we can just start there.
Well, as a composer, I think when we're planning pieces and developing constructs from which we try to develop ideas and so on, I think when I'm writing, oftentimes I don't necessarily start with the mathematical model, but I generally start with, shall we say, the models, the materials of music. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes we find that these models actually come up and they kind of arise from the materials. So perhaps there's something maybe inherent about these materials that give rise to a structure that is or can be construed as a mathematical structure.
Right. So that the listener is also like searching for that pattern, or
possibly,
that,
yeah.
The thing that, that they
possibly.
Yeah,
I think as you all experience, listening is such a variegated experience for everyone. It depends on prior experience, depends on culture, and so forth. So, oftentimes I don't think listeners might realize that there is a mathematical structure implicit in it, but it's not such a big concern, I think, with me.
I think many listeners can intuit certain archetypal forms. I mean, the golden ratio, the proportions in a picture of even a Japanese painting has found its way into Mozart's work. Bartók, of course, used the Fibonacci series to organize large structures with, the patterns from the Fibonacci representing the smaller segments. And somehow I think those are archetypes, they can just be intuitive if not consciously. They are a great resource for composers to stimulate a piece. In fact, I always think about balance and symmetry on the screen, and many times that is a ratio similar to the golden ratio, and that seems to work.
I think. Sorry. I do think that there are some differences between the visual domain and also the oral domain. I think symmetry is a good example where I think some symmetrical structures are easier to intuit visually than they might be to hear orally.
Sure.
For example, like the motive, going a certain direction, right? If you try to invert it, right? It's a little harder to do in the musical domain, I think. Sure. So, and you can actually look at some psychoacoustic research that might point to some more formalized results.
So for Dennis, something, you talked about in your talk, but we talked about when we were preparing for this, that one of your long-standing interests is using music composition as a model for structuring the animations. So it's not inherently mathematical, but it has a long history back to to 19th and early 20th century architects and artists who relied on music as a model, known as, just picking up what Hubert saying, visual music. And a good example that I thought of when we were talking about were Kandinsky and Schoenberg, who were in a long-term visual and musical conversation. And so, it's just interesting, your piece, Point Line Plane, is inspired by your own conversation.
Yeah. And there are some explicitly musical mathematical models that were part of that tradition. For example, Paul Klee's Fugue in Red is based on the exact proportions in a fugue of J.S. Bach. Klee was actually a very accomplished musician. He couldn't decide whether he wanted to be a painter or a violinist. I think Kandinsky was the cellist in that group. Thankfully for us, he took art as his career. But sometimes there is a very clear mathematical model in that tradition. On the other hand, more generally, the use of music as a model, as metaphor, let's say, is, it's just thousands of years old, and we could trace that through, in the Renaissance, Arcembalo, who did all the famous paintings of portraits with the head made out of fruit and animals. I don't know if you're familiar with, actually created a 12-tone gray scale. The term grayscale comes from his work hundreds of years ago that was based purely on the 12 chromatic notes. So there are a lot of connections there that go back well before the 19th century.
So we also talked about, you had a question for...
Oh, I had the great pleasure to review one of Hubert's courses the other day. We are colleagues. I've never sat in his class. And I was very, very impressed with Hubert's course. I have to say, there were kids looking at pages full of numbers exclaiming, wow, amazing, fantastic. And I kind of peeked over and there were some vectors and some sets. And I wonder if you could just tell us what were the musical implications of those vector groups that your kids were so excited about?
Okay, so yes, so I teach a course in mathematics and music at Northeastern, and they're writing final papers at this moment, so they're probably not here.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. And so I think that particular day we were looking at a model of the geometry of music, which is a model that Dmitry Tomashko, who's a colleague of mine at Princeton University, had developed over the years. And that happened to be a three-dimensional model of music, whereby each point that you saw in that paper represented a projection of that point on a two-dimensional space, and that point represented three notes. Right? So it's a tripled ordered pair, if you will. Right? So for example, the C major chord CDG. Right? So the vector would indicate that one chord is probably moving to another chord, or that maybe a component of the vector would indicate that the parallel motion was moving, as opposed to, say, the contrary component, right? I think that's how Professor Tomashko, that's how Dmitry had made his model.
Is that an analytical tool, or could it become a compositional?
I think it's both.
It could be both.
It's both. Yeah. I mean, in my exercises on their problem sets, they actually write these short chord progressions where they have to demonstrate that they're able to traverse the space and move from point to point. And what's interesting is that they might end up finding chord progressions that they would not have found based on their prior knowledge or experience as songwriters, or only having taken the more traditional kind of songwriting or theory 1 class. And what I think I was saying to you before the session today was that they actually can find chord progressions maybe using that model, whereby traditionally in our pedagogy, we would sort of reserve that for a third semester or fourth semester music theory class. So we sort of think of it as a more, quote, advanced progression, but kind of using these geometric models, they can maybe access it in a spatial way at an earlier age, perhaps.
Yeah. So they can get involved in more advanced theory.
Right.
Through
One
this
thing to say about mathematical modeling of music, however, is that it's still very controversial in a sense, because I think there's a kind of a population of people who is still very frightened about empirical approaches to music. I think there's a certain kind of critical tradition of thinking of music as being kind of purely emotional or purely spiritual. But I think I don't see I see a rapprochement, like a coming together of the two disciplines. I don't necessarily see kind of a juxtaposition or.
Well, Schoenberg's been suffering that, disdain for the last 100 years because he had the gall to propose a 12-tone set that would be used. Right. I mean, that was just, it's still controversial. I mean, it's never been fully accepted. I can understand. Right.
Just a question, just to continue to you, Hubert. So in your own work, working both kind of empirically or mathematically and more intuitively, it seems to happen sort of together? Or do you go back and forth?
To be honest, it's more back and forth. I mean, for this piece, I wasn't necessarily thinking of both of those circular spaces that I showed you. right? Those circular spaces was my reflecting upon what I had done before, right? I had written that piece I written that piece 4 years ago in 5 years, what year are we, 2020, 2016? 4 years ago, in 2012, that's when I had written the piece for the Harry Parch Festival at Northeastern. And so I went back for this, for this session, I went back and thought about what were some of the extant issues that came up while I was writing the piece, and I came to realize that I could intuit these mathematical structures based on my experience of having written that piece.
Yeah, when I did my very first animation 16 years ago, I very consciously tried to apply these musical processes. Okay, let's try some transposition and see what that means. But it's become completely intuitive by this point, so I don't really think about what process is involved here or how it relates to a musical structure. It's really just become ingrained in it for me as well.
So maybe we can address, which I think is a very, kind of a complicated idea or question, which is this relationship between, so does the empirical take away or, enhance in some way, or does it connect in some way to this need, I would say, for the emotional connection to music, which I think, all human beings, I think, need or want, So...
That's a tricky one.
I'm just posing it. And,
my interest as an artist, whether it's visual or musical, and I've done both over the years, is just to make something that really holds together. I mean, my first goal is to create a form, an organization that will hold the interest of the audience for 8 or 9 minutes, if I'm lucky. That's my initial. I mean, that's always the ultimate goal. The specific methods, the specific type of imagery, the synthesis approach, whatever, is certainly important and happens early on, but the idea is it's finished when it feels finished.
So in a sense, you're the first audience member.
I'm the first audience member, and I'm the one who I have to satisfy.
You have to kind of go through those steps, and then you say, oh, Hubert, could you watch this or listen? So that's kind of that editing and analyzing one does.
Criticizing, analyzing, editing, all of the above. Yeah, that's really it. And again, because my background was in music composition, and I did that for 20 years before I ever set pen to paper, it's such an abstract medium that I feel comfortable knowing when to stop and when things have to end. But it's never been an explicit, there's never been an attempt to portray any explicit emotion or object. It's totally non-objective, as Kandinsky has said, in terms of the imagery. And of course, the associations that people have and the specific emotion is fascinating to me, but never mandated in any way.
Yeah, I would say actually that they go well together in the sense that the emotionality and the spirituality is also not only embedded in the music, but also embedded in the mathematics, perhaps, or in these more abstract structures. Just to kind of envision yourself moving in these particular spaces and envision your music moving in these particular spaces, I think gives a sense of poetry and a sense of aesthetics in that process in itself, I think. I don't necessarily see them as separate entities.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that was clear in both your works. So that you kind of maybe start in the middle and go to the opposite ends, and then come back, through however you get there. So I don't know if any of the audience members want to join in, but we have a mic. Where's the mic? Aditya? There he is. Do we need a mic? Yes, he's coming. George, you'll go first. Aditya, down here, please, George.
That was all great. I want to burrow a little into a specific part that neither of you have really addressed, but is a subject that seems to have been ongoing throughout the 20th century. And I'm not so much saying that it informs either of your works, but I'm curious as to your thoughts on it, which is this constant question of what is the relationship between music and color, leading to a long history of people trying to create color organs and things like that. And so it has a theoretical basis, and it is an attempt to, light cadency take, yeah?
Yeah, I can address that. I have a slide, if I can find it quickly, or maybe I won't bother, that shows a dozen different attempts by artists over the past 300 years, from Newton until recent, with different mappings of colors to notes. So for Newton, red was C. For the next guy, it was D. For the next guy, it was blue. I mean, every one of them is different, and it's absolutely subjective. There's the wavelengths of color are in billionths of a meter. The wavelengths of music are feet long. Middle C is about 2.5 feet long, if you could visualize it. So there's absolutely no scientific basis for that. It's purely subjective, and whether C is red or D is red or E is red, it depends on who's asking. Yet I do believe there are other more subtle. I mean, Kandinsky himself said what's more interesting is to talk about musical timbres and color. So a flute is a very pale blue, and a trumpet is a dark blue. He laid it out. He has every single instrument, fairly well mapped to a different color. I mean, there's so much there, but I have to say, from my experience, when I started to do animation and was at music groups, music conferences, I found that many of the musicians who were just getting started didn't think a lot about color, and many of the colors were always saturated, and I took it upon myself to critique their work, my colleagues, and I said, well, having all saturated color is like having all the notes loud. I mean, there are just so many ways to think about this, but for me the fun part is in making those interpretations yourself, so maybe it's not a bad thing that there are 15 different color scales.
I will say that there is, I think, some current research, I think, ongoing and also recently published on synesthesia, on pitch and color, and I think Scriabin, I think, is well known for having. As was
Nabokov. Who saw colors with words.
Right. So for attaching particular chords and so forth. But it's yes, it definitely is a very very current topic.
Yeah. But I think even with the synesthetes, they have different colors for
right.
different
Yeah,
sounds.
necessarily consistent.
Purely scientific correlation.
Also individual.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But surely they must find some regularities. In any event, Hubert, I was curious, what do critics say? I mean, surely they must. What do they actually say if somebody is against what you're doing? You suggest that there are people like that, but I'm curious, what do they say?
Against, so you're talking about this relationship, the mathematical modeling of.
Yeah.
So I think it's not so much the music critics. I think within the music theoretical communities, I think there's perhaps a little bit of questioning of the eventual goals of the problem.
But what is it that people who are doing this questioning actually say?
Well, I think it's just a matter of the value of the base of knowledge, right? I mean, is it worthy to try to find shapes where that these chords are residing in? Does it become too kind of abstract from actual musical experience? Does it
abstracted from actual musical experience?
Right.
Yeah.
Whose experience? I mean, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think there was Brian, I think, yeah.
Hey, so Hubert, I was curious how you chose the notes in that scale, because I noticed you didn't have all of the small integer ratios, like 11/7 wasn't there, I think, and
Well, which one?
11/7, I think wasn't.
So I chose a 7-limit scale. So all the numbers had to be multiples of primes that have 7 or less. I also, if you saw, I also removed the first, what we would tier as a whole step, right? The first, like the 9/8 or the 10/9s, I also removed. just to limit the number of notes. So I chose this sort of based on a chart from Harry Parch, since it was a Harry Parch symposium which I wrote for. I chose it based on his charts, but I chose it selectively. Right? So he has a particular scale that actually is 43 notes to the octave, right? So,
as part of your process, would you, the way you told the story, at least, is it sounds like you made the scale and then you made the piece. But is that sort of the way it is, or is it sort of like you're making a piece and maybe you say, this didn't work, let me try a different scale? Is it kind of...
Well, what's tricky is that the guitar, just to get into the technical aspects, the guitar is equal tempered, right? And so if you look on the internet, you will find some people who have D-fretted their guitars, and they have just actually created just intonation guitar where every string has a different position to play. Right? So as part of the process, I think I actually did start with the scale because I knew I was conscientiously using a JI scale, and I was writing this microtonal music for this particular lesson. And then I forced myself to kind of hear these new harmonies, essentially learn almost a new language, right? Because I'm so used to hearing the 12-tone equal tempered system that I'm kind of forced to reevaluate.
Thank you.
Was there another question?
Sorry, Dennis. I think I missed, and I hate if everybody else got this, but I didn't, but the connection between the sound and the animation, technically, is how is that something that that is driven by? Can you describe that connection?
Yeah, it's purely intuitive. There's a lot of work out there now that ties parameters together. You know, the idea of a color organ, which I think George was alluding to earlier, is hundreds of years old. I mean, literally 18th century, when a key was pressed, a light illuminated, and then in the 19th century it was an electrical light, and on and on and on. That doesn't appeal to me particularly. In fact, I try to avoid it entirely. But it's totally intuitive. You know, in my process, sometimes the music will advance beyond where I am in the pictures. I mean, I'm composing these two things somewhat simultaneously. Sometimes the pictures will advance 4 or 5 minutes of imagery and no idea what the music will do. But there's absolutely no connection between the parameters. Nothing drives the other. It's just my sense of what works. And it's like a film score, except sometimes I'm scoring to the picture and sometimes I'm picturing to the score. You know, the opposite process. Either can happen, but no real technical tie as you're describing. Yeah. That gets a little monotonous quickly in my mind. Yeah, it can be.
Anybody else? We have time for one more. No? Oh, okay. One more from you.
For both of you, I'm sort of curious, when you show your work, how important is it that the audience understands some of the background? Like, is it important that they understand Hubert, that it's a scale, for you
That's
that
a really
it's,
good
you know,
question.
grains of sand and this particle system?
No, and I don't expect them to. I mean, that's the problem we both face as modern composers. You know, there are few, if any, associations in this music that an audience would tend to have. Every piece kind of presents its own priorities. You know, some things that come back repeatedly and get developed, and other things that just pass on. And an audience can't know that. And it's been a struggle, you know, my entire career to find a way to communicate something to an audience on the first attempt, you know, the first viewing or hearing, but certainly understanding that so many of the details will just be missed. So I don't write extensive program notes explaining things. I mean, I just leave it to an audience's imagination to interpret things as they will. I mean, I had an image on the screen the other day, and my wife said, "Oh, finally you're doing something for me." She's a cell biologist. She says, "Well, that's just what a red blood cell looks like going through the vessels." I said, "Well, you know, I had no clue." So I love the fact that people will interpret the images and bring their own association, but I'm never imposing that. And the technical part of it is really just my business. You know, it's not something I expect people to understand. Is that true for you as well?
Yeah, I generally agree. I mean, I think the art that I do, and I think the art that many people do, hopefully can gain a wide audience, ranging from the people who have kind of encountered that particular genre or style for the first time to those who are very well versed in it, right? So it's not important that they know that there was a just intonation 13-tone scale used in this particular case. It so happened that this was written for a festival where everyone had already listened to a lot of music with microtones, in particular Harry Partch's music. So there was already kind of a social context embedded. But that being said, I hope that the piece is also communicative and emotive for those people who are not as familiar with that music.
Can I add one thing? Milton Babbitt, famous 20th century composer, got a very bad name for an article that he did not entitle "Who Cares If You Listen?" His editor added that title to the article. So now I hear people saying, well, Babbitt's article, who cares if, he was... The point being that, you write first and foremost for what drives you to work and gets you up in the morning, and, it's great when the technical aspects are understood, or maybe it adds, just like it adds to my appreciation when I can see the devices Stravinsky used or Beethoven even used, that just adds to my enjoyment, but it certainly doesn't limit, my enjoyment of a work of art when I don't know the process. Mostly I don't.
So, that's a perfect place to end. And I want to thank you both for a really terrific presentations and conversations. So, and, I just want to mention a couple things that the program today was organized in conjunction with